The nature of peace is often found in its predictability, in the way the sun rises over the eucalyptus trees and the morning dew clings to the manicured lawns of a quiet suburb. We like to believe that the walls of a home are a fortress, a sacred boundary where the chaos of the outside world is filtered into nothing more than the distant hum of traffic. But sometimes, that peace is a fragile veneer, and the silence that follows a sudden disruption is not the silence of rest, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a story that has ended far too soon. Tonight, we find ourselves in the outskirts of Brisbane, Australia. It is February, the tail end of a humid summer, where the air is thick with the scent of rain and the sounds of the bush. In the residential pocket of Believer, life usually moves with a rhythmic, gentle cadence. It is a place of schools, community gardens, and families who know one another by the cars they drive and the pets they walk. Among them was Kate Patterson, a 38-year-old woman whose life was defined by the act of nurturing. As a dedicated teacher at Logan Village State School, she spent her days shaping the futures of others, and more recently, she had embraced the profound, exhausting joy of motherhood with her 1-year-old daughter, April. They were the heartbeat of a home on Believer Road, a place where the evidence of a life well lived was scattered in the small details. A child's toy left on the grass, a stack of teaching materials on a desk, the domestic quietude of a Thursday morning. The geography of the Logan area is a blend of suburban sprawl and rural edges, where long stretches of road connect the small communities that form the southern reach of Brisbane. Beaudesert Binley Road is one of those arteries, a thoroughfare that carries workers to their offices and parents to school gates. On the morning of February 11th, the weather was typical for a Queensland summer, warm, expectant, and seemingly ordinary. People were beginning their commutes, sipping coffee and listening to the radio, unaware that the map of their community was about to be indelibly marked by a tragedy that defies easy explanation. When we look at these maps, we see lines and coordinates. But for those who live there, the landscape is a tapestry of memories. For Kate, this was her territory of service and love. For the neighbors, it was a sanctuary. But at 7:30 a.m., that sanctuary was pierced by a metallic crunch and the frantic movements of a man who seemed to be fleeing a ghost only he could see. The incident began not at the home, but on the asphalt of Beaudesert Binley Road. The sun was already climbing, casting long shadows across the bitumen as the morning rush intensified. Drivers reported a scene that felt disconnected from reality. A 39-year-old man was seen running toward the flow of traffic. He wasn't waving for help or trying to cross safely. Witness accounts would later suggest a desperate, intentional trajectory. Even more chilling was the physical state of the man. Before the impact with a vehicle ever occurred, observers noted a significant, visible injury to his neck, a dark crimson bloom against his skin that spoke of violence already visited upon himself. When the collision finally happened, the world slowed down. The screech of tires, the heavy thud of a body against a frame, and then the sudden ringing silence that follows a trauma. Emergency responders, or the AMBOs as they are known in this part of the world, arrived within minutes. To the initial witnesses and the first police on the scene, this looked like a chaotic mental health crisis or a tragic roadside accident. The man was unconscious, his breathing labored, his life hanging by a thread as paramedics worked over him on the hot pavement. They treated the jagged wound on his neck and the blunt force trauma from the car, unaware that 10 miles away, the true gravity of the morning was waiting behind a closed front door. At this stage, the investigation was a standard response to a traffic casualty. There was no reason to suspect that this man, later identified as Blake Sears, was the key to a much darker discovery. The police were simply doing their duty, securing the scene, gathering witness statements, and attempting to identify the man so they could perform the most difficult task of their profession: a welfare check and family notification. In the confusion of the roadside, officers located identification that linked the unconscious man to a property on Beliva Road. It is a short drive, perhaps 15 minutes, through the winding suburban streets. As the cruisers made their way toward the house, the officers likely rehearsed the words they would say to the woman waiting inside. They would tell her there had been an accident, that her partner was in the hospital, and that she needed to come with them. They expected to find a worried partner, perhaps a crying child, and the frantic energy of a family upended by bad news. But as they turned onto the gravel and pulled up to the residence, the energy they encountered was entirely different. Local resident Riley Evans was one of the few people outside at the time. He watched as the police cars, ambulances, and even a fire brigade unit descended on the quiet street. From his perspective, it was an escalation that didn't match a simple notification. He saw the coppers move toward the house with a deliberate, cautious pace. There was a heavy silence hanging over the property, a lack of movement that felt unnatural for a home with a toddler and a professional woman starting her day. When the officers knocked, there was no answer. When they entered, the narrative of a roadside accident dissolved instantly, replaced by a crime scene that would haunt the Logan community for years to come. Inside the home, the routine ended, and the investigation into the deaths of Kate Patterson and little April began. This was not a house of chaos, but a house of interrupted life. Kate had recently returned to work from maternity leave, a transition that marks a significant milestone for any new mother. She was a woman of structure and care, a teacher who understood the value of a safe environment. To find her and her 1-year-old daughter deceased inside their own sanctuary was a shock that rippled through the officers on the scene. Both mother and child bore the marks of a violent encounter, specifically stab wounds inflicted by what investigators would describe as an edged weapon. The contrast was unbearable. The clinical language of forensics applied to a nursery and a family home. As the forensic tape was unspooled and the house was cordoned off, the community began to wake up to a reality they couldn't process. The man on the road wasn't just a victim of a crash. He was the sole survivor of a domestic eclipse. Would you like me to begin drafting the full script for Chapter 2? The identification of Blake Sears, focusing on the emergency response, and the link to the Beliva Road property. The paramedics at the scene on Beaudesert Binlay Road worked with a practiced, rhythmic efficiency, their gloved hands moving through the humid morning air as they stabilized the man found lying on the asphalt. The initial radio calls had described a standard pedestrian strike, but as the AMBOs cut away the man's clothing to assess his vitals, the nature of the emergency shifted. Beneath the trauma caused by the vehicle's impact lay a jagged, deeper laceration across his neck, an injury that did not align with the physics of a car bumper or the graze of the road. It was a wound that whispered of a different kind of violence, one that had preceded the screech of tires. As the man was lifted into the ambulance, his state was critical, slipping into a deep unconsciousness that left the police with a silent puzzle. While the sirens faded toward the hospital, officers began the methodical process of identifying the patient. They searched for a wallet, a phone, or any discarded personal effects near the point of impact. It was through this roadside inventory that they found the name Blake Sears. He was 39 years old, a local resident whose life was anchored to a property just 10 miles away. At first, the connection seemed purely administrative, a standard procedure to find next of kin and deliver the news that a husband or father was fighting for his life in a trauma ward. The 10-mile stretch between the crash site in Logan and the home on Beliva Road represents a brief journey through the green fringes of Brisbane's outskirts, a drive that takes less than 15 minutes under normal conditions. Yet, in the early hours of that Thursday, those 10 miles served as a bridge between two vastly different tragedies. As the police cruisers began that short drive toward the suburb of Beliva, they were operating under the assumption of a welfare check. They expected to find a worried partner, perhaps a house waking up to the sounds of a typical school morning. They had no way of knowing that the man they had just sent to the hospital was the only person who knew why the house they were approaching had already fallen into a permanent, heavy stillness. The transition from a traffic investigation to a homicide inquiry is rarely a sudden leap. It is a slow, chilling realization that begins with the smallest details. As the officers turned onto Beliva Road, the morning sun was climbing higher, casting long shadows across the well-kept lawns and the quiet suburban architecture. They were looking for a house that belonged to a family, a place where a teacher named Kate Patterson lived with her young daughter. The cruisers slowed as they approached the address linked to Blake Sears' identification, the officers checking house numbers against their digital displays. To any neighbor watching from behind a curtain, it looked like a routine visit, perhaps a notification about a minor accident. But as the officers stepped out of their vehicles and walked toward the front door, the atmosphere of the neighborhood seemed to thicken. There was no movement behind the windows, no sound of a television or a radio, and no sign of the frantic energy that usually defines a home with a 1-year-old child. The link between the man on the road and this specific patch of dirt was about to be cemented in a way that would haunt the Logan community for years to come. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep, finding a strange kind of comfort in the steady resolution of the past. Tonight, we travel to the outskirts of Brisbane, Australia. It is February, the height of the late southern summer, where the air is thick with the scent of eucalyptus and the heavy, humid heat that preceded the evening storms. In the suburb of Beliva, the morning sun usually brings with it the sounds of a neighborhood waking up, the low hum of commuters, the chirping of cicadas, and the distant bustle of the Logan Village State School. This is a story about a quiet neighborhood, a dedicated teacher named Kate, and a morning that began with a crash, but ended in a silence no one expected. To understand the weight of what happened on Beliva Road, we must first look at the geography of this place. Logan and Beliva sit in a pocket of Queensland, where the urban sprawl of the city begins to give way to larger blocks of land and semi-rural peace. It is the kind of area where people move to find space, to raise families under wide skies, and to enjoy a slower pace of life. The roads here, like Beaudesert-Benlay Road, are the arteries of the community, lined with long stretches of grass and sturdy fencing. On February 11th, the weather was typical for a Brisbane summer, bright, clear, and promising a day of routine. But at 7:30 a.m., that routine was shattered. While most families were finishing breakfast or packing school bags, a chaotic scene was unfolding on the asphalt 10 miles away from a modest family home. The peace of the morning was not broken by a natural storm, but by a sequence of events that started with a man on a highway and led back to a house where the clocks were still ticking. But time had already stopped. As we settle into the details of this investigation, remember that the story we are telling is now part of the quiet history of this land, a tragedy that has found its conclusion in the archives of the law. The shift from a standard traffic accident to a double murder investigation did not happen all at once. It was a slow, methodical realization that began with the arrival of the first responders. When the paramedics, or the AMBOs as they are known locally, pulled up to the scene on Beaudesert-Benlay Road, they expected to find a victim of a high-speed collision. They found a man, later identified as 39-year-old Blake Sears, but the nature of his injuries did not immediately align with the physics of the crash. There were witnesses who had seen him moments before the impact, accounts that described a man not simply crossing the road, but running toward the flow of traffic. Even more unsettling was the observation made by those first on the scene. Sears already appeared to have a severe injury to his neck before the vehicle struck him. As the medical teams worked to stabilize him, the police began the standard procedure of identifying the individual and locating his next of kin. They found his address, a property on Beliva Road. At that moment, the officers believed they were heading toward a residence to deliver the difficult news that a husband and father had been seriously injured. They expected to find a woman named Kate Patterson, perhaps getting her 1-year-old daughter, April, ready for the day, unaware of the trauma unfolding 10 miles away. Instead, they were walking into a silence that would change the course of the investigation and leave a permanent mark on the Brisbane teaching community. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 1? The incident at Logan, detailing the specific witness accounts and the arrival of the emergency services at the crash site. To understand the gravity of what follows, we must first understand the ground upon which these events unfolded. Beliva and Logan are not places defined by chaos. They are the quiet, sturdy lungs of southeast Queensland. Situated roughly halfway between the glittering high-rises of Brisbane and the sandy stretches of the Gold Coast, these suburbs are where the urban sprawl finally begins to exhale. It is a landscape of transition, where residential fences give way to hobby farms, and the air smells of eucalyptus and cut grass rather than exhaust. Logan Village, in particular, maintains a pride in its heritage, a pocket of colonial history where the Albert River winds lazily through the scrub. It is the kind of place where neighbors recognize each other's cars, and where the local school is the undisputed heart of the community. Bolivar Road itself is a long, arterial stretch that feels more like a country lane than a suburban street. Here, the houses sit back from the asphalt, often shielded by thickets of wattle or neat timber railings. It is a geography of privacy and peace, favored by young families and retirees who seek the stillness of the bush without sacrificing the convenience of the city. To the residents here, the sounds of the morning are predictable. The warble of magpies, the distant hum of a lawnmower, and the rhythmic crunch of gravel under tires as teachers and tradespeople head toward the Beaudesert-Benlay Road. This main thoroughfare serves as the region's lifeline, a busy vein of bitumen that connects these sleepy pockets to the wider world. On any given Thursday, the transition from the silence of Bolivar to the bustle of Logan is a mundane ritual. But on this February morning, that 10-mile stretch of road became a bridge between two vastly different realities, turning a sanctuary into a site of profound clinical scrutiny. The morning light began to sharpen against the asphalt as the first responders arrived at the scene on Beaudesert-Benlay Road. It was approximately 7:30 a.m. when the rhythm of the morning commute was shattered, not by a mechanical failure, but by a sight that left witnesses struggling to process what they were seeing. Reports from the scene described a 39-year-old man, later identified as Blake Sears, appearing on the edge of the thoroughfare in a state of visible distress. Witnesses would later recount the harrowing detail of seeing him move toward the flow of traffic, his silhouette framed by the rising sun, bearing a significant and gruesome injury to his neck. The impact was sudden, a heavy thud of metal against bone that brought the local traffic to a grinding halt. When the AMBOs, the local paramedics, and police units arrived, the atmosphere was one of chaotic urgency typical of a high-speed vehicle strike. They found Sears on the ground, his breathing labored, the copper scent of blood mingling with the smell of exhaust and heated rubber. Initially, the responding officers treated the incident as a tragic, if somewhat standard, roadside accident involving a pedestrian. There was no immediate reason to suspect that the man fighting for his life on the bitumen was the tether to a much darker domestic scene unfolding 10 miles away. The paramedics worked with practiced efficiency, their gloved hands moving over Sears to stabilize the trauma from both the car's impact and the jagged wound at his throat. As they prepared him for transport to the hospital, the police began the routine task of inventorying the scene. It was during this process, the simple administrative act of checking for identification to notify next of kin, that the focus of the investigation began to shift. They found the documents that linked the injured man to a specific property on Bolivar Road, a quiet residential pocket where the morning was until that moment, still draped in an unsuspecting peace. The distance between the crash site and the family home was roughly 10 miles, a short drive that usually takes less than 15 minutes through the rolling outskirts of the Logan area. As the sirens of the ambulance faded toward the hospital, a separate set of cruisers began the journey back toward that address. The officers were operating under the assumption of a death knock or a welfare notification, the heavy duty of telling a partner that their loved one had been severely injured. They moved through the familiar geography of the Brisbane suburbs, past the schools and the local shops, unaware that every mile brought them closer to a silence that would eventually echo across the entire country. Upon pulling into the driveway of the Beliva Road property, the transition from routine to catastrophe was almost instantaneous. The house itself sat as a testament to a settled suburban life. It was the home of a teacher, marked by the orderly charm of someone who spent their days organizing the lives of others. There were signs of a lived-in warmth, perhaps a stray toy, or the well-tended greenery of a garden, that suggested the domesticity of a young family. However, as the officers stepped onto the porch, the air felt heavy, lacking the typical morning sounds of a household starting its day. Neighbor Riley Evans watched from a distance as the police cruisers and fire brigade units began to multiply along the curb. He would later recall the suddenness of the escalation, noting how the quiet neighborhood was abruptly swallowed by the clinical flickering of blue and red lights. What Evans and the other residents initially perceived as a secondary response to the crash soon revealed itself to be something far more gravity-bound. The front door was opened, and the routine notification vanished, replaced by the grim realization that the interior of the home had become a sealed forensic environment. The intimacy ratio of the scene was profound. To understand the weight of what the investigators found, one must look at the life of the woman who lived there. Kate Patterson was 38 years old, a woman whose identity was deeply rooted in the soil of the Logan Village State School community. She was known not just as an educator, but as a pillar of the faculty, someone who had recently navigated the monumental life shift from a dedicated teacher to a new mother. Her home was a physical map of this transition, filled with the tools of her trade, teaching aids, books, and lesson plans, intermingled with the soft, pastel geography of a nursery. Kate's reputation in the Brisbane teaching community was one of nurturing and steadfastness. She had just returned to her post from maternity leave, a period often defined by the bittersweet balance of professional duty and the pull of a new life at home. To her colleagues and students, she represented a safe harbor, a woman whose career was dedicated to the protection and growth of children. This professional profile stood in a haunting, silent contrast to the violence that had claimed her life within the very walls intended to be her sanctuary. Side by side with Kate was her 1-year-old daughter, April. The loss of a child this young carries a specific kind of atmospheric weight. It is the loss of unwritten chapters. April had only recently celebrated her first birthday, a milestone that usually signals the beginning of a child's true engagement with the world. The first steady steps, the first complex sounds of language. Her world was composed of specific sensory anchors: the particular shade of a nursery wall, the smell of baby powder, and the constant, reassuring presence of her mother. The bond between the two was evident even in the stillness of the room where they were found, their lives having been inextricably intertwined. until the final tragic moment. As Detective Superintendent Chris Ahern would later confirm in a hushed press conference, the technical reality of the scene was stark. Both victims had suffered injuries consistent with an edged weapon, a clinical term that does little to mask the personal nature of such trauma. Forensic teams began the meticulous process of reconstruction, using biological markers to establish an estimated time of death. They sought to bridge the gap, those missing hours between the domestic tragedy in the early morning and the moment Blake Sears appeared on the road 10 miles away. The investigation moved into a deep dive of the vehicle's path, mapping GPS data and seeking witness accounts to determine if the car had been idling in the driveway for hours or if it had been driven aimlessly through the pre-dawn mist. While the forensic tape was being strung across the yard, Blake Sears remained under hospital watch, lying unconscious in a coma. His self-inflicted neck wound and the trauma from the car impact kept him tethered to a hospital bed. While outside, the legal machinery began the slow process of formalizing double murder allegations. The community's response was a sea of blue ribbons and floral tributes that began to pile up at the school gates and the edge of the Beliva Road property. Logan Village was a place where everyone seemed to know the name of the teacher who helped their child read, and the collective grief was palpable. Vitals were held, and hushed conversations took place on street corners as parents struggled to explain the inexplicable to their children. Eventually, the forensic teams finished their work. The tape was removed, and the house was left to return to a hollow, echoing silence, leaving only the legacy of a mother and daughter to be remembered in the stillness of the Brisbane night. Would you like me to begin drafting the full script for the final reflections, focusing on the psychological resolution and the legacy of Kate and April? The morning of February 11th began with the ordinary rhythmic sounds of a Brisbane summer, the distant hum of cicadas and the early commute of workers heading toward the city. But at 7:30 a.m., on a stretch of Beaudesert Benlay Road in Logan, that rhythm was violently interrupted. This particular artery of the suburb, usually a predictable corridor for morning traffic, suddenly became the stage for a sequence of events that defied the logic of a typical Thursday. Drivers who were sipping their morning coffee or mentally preparing for their workdays were forced to slam on their brakes as the mundane reality of the road shifted into something far more chaotic and distressing. The asphalt was warm under the climbing sun, and the air held that heavy, humid stillness common to Queensland in late summer. Yet the atmosphere on the road was anything but still. Witnesses at the scene described a sight that was as confusing as it was alarming. They didn't just see a pedestrian involved in an accident. They saw a man whose movements were frantic, driven by a desperate internal momentum. Reports began to circulate of a figure, later identified as 39-year-old Blake Sears, appearing from the roadside. He wasn't simply crossing the street. Accounts from those behind the wheel suggested he was running directly toward the flow of traffic. What struck the onlookers most, however, wasn't just his erratic behavior, but the visible trauma already present on his body. Before any metal had touched him, witnesses noted a significant injury to his neck area, a deep crimson mark that stood out starkly against his skin in the bright morning light. It was a detail that suggested the violence of this day had begun long before he reached the pavement of Bodser Binley Road. The impact, when it finally occurred, brought the morning to a grinding halt. The screech of tires and the dull thud of a collision replaced the suburban quiet, leaving Sears lying on the ground, gravely injured. Within minutes, the air was filled with the rising wail of sirens as the AMBOs, the local paramedics, and Queensland police officers raced to the coordinates. At this early stage, the first responders were operating under the assumption of a standard, albeit severe, traffic incident. They saw a man with life-threatening injuries, a distressed driver, and a road that needed to be cleared. The paramedics worked with clinical efficiency, focusing on stabilizing the man who remained unconscious. His breathing labored. The police began the routine work of cordoning off the area and taking statements from shaken witnesses. There was no immediate reason to look beyond the perimeter of the crash site. No sign yet that this trauma was merely the outer ripple of a much deeper, darker pool of tragedy located 10 miles away at a home on Beliva Road. To the officers directing traffic and the paramedics monitoring vitals, this was a singular emergency, a man in crisis on a busy road. They moved through their protocols with the practiced calm of those who see such things often, unaware that the identification found in the man's pockets would soon turn a traffic investigation into one of the most heartbreaking welfare checks in the history of the Logan district. The blue and red lights continued to flash against the trees lining the road, casting long, rhythmic shadows, while the true scale of the morning's horror remained hidden behind the closed doors of a quiet teacher's residence, waiting to be discovered. The process of identifying the man lying on the bitumen was the first thread to be pulled in a tapestry that was rapidly unraveling. As the emergency crews worked to keep Blake Sears alive, they followed the standard procedure of searching for any form of identification that could tell them who he was and who needed to be notified of his condition. It is a grim but necessary part of the job, finding a wallet or a phone to bridge the gap between an anonymous patient and a family waiting at home. When they finally looked at the documents Sears carried, the name was confirmed, and an address was linked to his identity, a property on Beliva Road. At that moment, the officers believed they were preparing for one of the most difficult tasks in policing, delivering the news of a tragic accident to a spouse or a partner. The distance between the crash site at Logan and the home in Beliva was roughly 10 miles, a short drive that usually takes less than 20 minutes through the winding suburban streets. As the police cruisers began that journey, the man they had just left was being rushed to the hospital in a coma, his life hanging by a thread due to a combination of the car's impact and the self-inflicted wounds to his neck. The officers driving toward the house likely rehearsed what they would say, bracing themselves for the shock and grief they expected to encounter upon their arrival. They were heading toward a home owned by Kate Patterson, a respected teacher who had only recently returned to her professional life after the birth of her daughter. As the patrol cars turned onto the quiet residential stretch of Beliva Road, the contrast between the scene they had just left and the environment they were entering was jarring. This was a neighborhood characterized by well-kept gardens, the occasional sound of a mower, and the general peacefulness of a community where people knew their neighbors by name. There was nothing on the exterior of the house to suggest anything was amiss. The lawn was tidy, the structure was sound, and the morning sun glinted off the windows. Yet, there was a specific kind of silence hanging over the property, a stillness that felt heavy and expectant. Riley Evans, a local resident who lived nearby, would later recall the moment the coppers and the ambos pulled up. To the neighbors, the sight of multiple emergency vehicles arriving at a house usually known for its tranquility was a cause for immediate concern, but the prevailing thought was that perhaps someone had suffered a medical emergency or a fall. Riley watched from his window, noting the arrival of the fire brigade alongside the police, a sight that usually signals a complex rescue or a hazardous scene. He, like many others, initially assumed it was related to a car crash nearby, perhaps involving someone from the street. He had no way of knowing that the police weren't there to deliver news, but to find the center of a storm that had already passed, leaving a devastating silence in its wake. The transition from a routine notification to a crime scene investigation happens in a heartbeat, a singular moment where the atmosphere shifts and the professional mask of an officer tightens. When the police stepped onto the porch of the Beliva Road home, the objective was simple: find Kate Patterson and inform her that her partner had been involved in a serious incident. They knocked, expecting the sound of footsteps or perhaps the muffled cry of a 1-year-old baby, but no one answered. The house remained unresponsive, a silent sentinel in the middle of a bustling morning. It was this lack of response, combined with the context of the man's injuries 10 miles away, that prompted the officers to gain entry. Upon entering the home, the routine ended instantly. The interior of the house was a reflection of Kate's life, a space filled with the markers of a dedicated educator and a nurturing mother. There were teaching aids, books, and the colorful, soft textures of a nursery. But cutting through this domestic peace was the stark, clinical reality of a crime scene. In the quiet of the rooms, the officers discovered the bodies of 38-year-old Kate Patterson and her 1-year-old daughter, April. The scene was static, a frozen tableau of a life interrupted. Detective Superintendent Chris Ahern would later confirm to the media that both mother and child had suffered significant injuries, specifically stab wounds that appeared to have been caused by an edged weapon. The discovery sent an immediate shockwave through the ranks of the responding officers. The focus shifted from the road at Logan to the floorboards of Beliva Road. The house was quickly cordoned off with forensic tape, that bright yellow barrier that signals to the world that something unthinkable has occurred. Forensic teams in white suits began the painstaking process of documenting every inch of the environment, looking for the timeline of events that led from the previous night into the early hours of Thursday morning. The safe container of the Brisbane suburbs had been breached, and the silence that Riley Evans had noted earlier was now understood to be the heavy, suffocating silence of a tragedy that had already reached its conclusion. As the news began to filter out to the community, the image of Kate Patterson began to take shape for those who didn't know her. She wasn't just a statistic or a victim. she was a woman deeply woven into the fabric of the Logan Village State School. She was a teacher who had spent her career shaping young minds, a woman who had recently embraced the profound joy of motherhood. To see her life, and the life of her infant daughter, reduced to a forensic investigation, was a weight that the community of Brisbane would struggle to carry. The investigation was now a double murder inquiry, and the man lying in a hospital bed 10 miles away was no longer just an accident victim, but the sole person of interest in a case that had turned a quiet Thursday into a day of mourning. To understand the depth of what was lost on Beliva Road, one must look at the life Kate Patterson built. In the world of true crime, we often speak of victimology, the study of the individuals affected by tragedy. But this is often a clinical term for something much more human. Kate was 38 years old, an age where many feel they are finally hitting their stride, balancing the wisdom of experience with the energy of a future still unfolding. She was a fixture at Logan Village State School, a place where she wasn't just an employee, but a mentor. Her colleagues described her as a dedicated educator, someone who possessed the rare intimacy ratio, the ability to make every student feel seen and every lesson feel personal. Her home was an extension of this personality. When investigators walked through the rooms, they didn't just see a crime scene. They saw the physical evidence of a woman who nurtured growth. There were shelves lined with teaching resources, hand-organized folders, and a garden that showed the care of someone who enjoyed the slow, steady process of cultivation. Kate had recently navigated the major life transition from a full-time educator to a new mother, a period of life that is often exhausting but filled with a unique kind of light. She had just returned to work from maternity leave, a milestone that usually signals a return to a sense of self and a new balance in domestic life. The contrast between Kate's dedication to nurturing and the violence that ended her life is a point of profound psychological weight. She was a woman who spent her days teaching children how to navigate the world with kindness and curiosity, only to have her own journey cut short within the sanctuary of her home. The Brisbane teaching community felt this loss as a literal tear in their fabric. At the school gates, the silence was different than the silence at the house. It was a silence born of shock, of teachers having to look into the eyes of their students and find a way to explain why a beloved figure wouldn't be returning to the classroom. Kate's standing in the community was rooted in her reliability and her warmth. She was the person you went to for advice on a difficult lesson plan or a steady hand during a stressful school event. In the aftermath, the tributes that began to appear weren't just about her professional achievements, but about her spirit, the way she laughed, the way she cared for her plants, and the fierce, protective love she held for her daughter. It is this restoration of identity that matters most in the wake of such events. Remembering Kate not for the edged weapon or the forensic tape, but for the hundreds of lives she touched in the quiet classrooms of Logan Village. Then there is the memory of little April. At just 1 year old, April was a life that was almost entirely potential. She had recently celebrated her first birthday, a milestone that represents the transition from a helpless infant to a toddler with a budding personality. In the nursery on Beliva Road, The sensory details of her world were still vibrant. The specific shades of the walls chosen by her parents, the toys that sat waiting to be played with, and the developmental markers that every parent tracks with pride. She had reached the age of discovery, where the world is a series of firsts. First steps, first words, first tastes of the world beyond her crib. The loss of a child carries a specific kind of grief because it involves the mourning of unwritten chapters. We don't just mourn who April was, but who she was going to be. We mourn the first day of school she would never attend, the friendships she would never form, and the adult she would never become. The investigation noted that April was found alongside her mother, a detail that speaks to the profound and tragic bond they shared in their final moments. In life, they were intertwined through the daily routines of feedings, play, and sleep. In death, they remained together, leaving a void that no amount of investigation could ever truly fill. The sensory world of a 1-year-old is small and focused. The warmth of a blanket, the sound of a mother's voice, the safety of a familiar room. For that safety to be violated is a concept that the human mind instinctively recoils from. As the community of Brisbane began to process the tragedy, the blue ribbons that appeared for Kate were often accompanied by small toys or white flowers for April. These were symbols of a community trying to offer the protection in death that the child didn't receive in life. The tragedy of April is the ultimate reminder of the fragility of peace, a reminder that the most vulnerable among us rely on a sanctuary that should be absolute. In the days following the discovery, the forensic deep dive began in earnest, led by Detective Superintendent Chris Ahern. The technical reconstruction of a crime scene is a cold, clinical process designed to strip away the emotion and find the truth in the physics of the event. The use of the term edged weapon in the police reports pointed to a specific kind of trauma, one that is personal and immediate. Forensic analysts work to determine the sequence of events, using biological markers to establish an estimated time of death, ETD. This timeline was crucial, as it revealed a significant gap between the time Kate and April were killed and the moment Blake Sears appeared on Bodser Beenleigh Road. This gap, these missing hours, became the focus of the investigation. What happened in the house after the violence ended? Mapping the vehicle's path through GPS data and witness accounts, investigators sought to understand the movement of the car during the early morning. Did it sit in the driveway for hours? Was it driven aimlessly through the Brisbane suburbs as the sun began to rise? The movement of the car was a physical manifestation of a psychological state, a trail of data points leading from a house of silence to a road of chaos. The trauma analysis also looked at the nature of Sears' own injuries. The neck wound he sustained was evaluated against the injuries of the victims, providing a clearer picture of the events inside the home. In domestic tragedies involving an edged weapon, the forensic evidence often tells a story of a sudden, catastrophic break in the domestic peace. The clinical nature of this analysis, the measuring of wounds, the testing of DNA, the reconstruction of the timeline, is the only way the legal system can begin to provide a form of justice, even when that justice feels hollow in the face of such profound loss. As the forensic tape was eventually removed and the house on Beliva Road was returned to the family, the investigation moved into a new phase. The open-mind philosophy that Detective Superintendent Ahern initially spoke of began to solidify into a concrete case file. The evidence collected in those first 48 hours would form the basis of the legal proceedings to follow, a mountain of data meant to answer the how, even if the why remained perpetually out of reach. While the forensic teams worked the scene, Blake Sears remained in a critical condition at the hospital. His recovery was monitored not just by doctors, but by a constant police presence. The hospital watch. For days he remained in a coma, a man suspended between life and death while the world outside his hospital room demanded answers. The legal progression was tethered to his medical status. Charges cannot be formally answered by a man who is unconscious. Yet the gravity of the allegations was such that the legal machinery began to turn in anticipation of his awakening. The self-inflicted nature of his neck wound, contrasted with the trauma from the car impact, created a complex medical profile. When he finally regained consciousness, the procedural steps were immediate. The formalization of charges, the double murder of Kate and April, was presented, marking the transition from a medical emergency to a criminal prosecution. For the community, there was a grim sort of relief in this progression, a sense that the person responsible would be held to account, even if that accountability could never restore what was taken. The investigation's conclusion brought a sense of closure to the active crime scene, but the psychological impact on the community remained. The floral tributes at the school gates grew, and the blue ribbons continued to flutter in the Brisbane breeze. A community vigil was held, a gathering of hundreds who stood in a silence that was finally respectful rather than tragic. They spoke in hushed conversations, lit candles that flickered against the night, and shared stories of Kate's kindness. It was an act of collective mourning, a way for the people of Logan and Beliva to reclaim their neighborhood from the shadows of the events of February 11th. In the end, as the final police statements were issued, and the house on Beliva Road stood empty, the focus returned to the legacy of the mother and daughter. They are remembered not for the way they died, but for the way they lived. The teacher who inspired, and the baby who was just beginning to learn. The story of Beliva Road is a heavy one, a reminder of the fragility of the peace we often take for granted. But as the sun sets over Brisbane and the city settles into the safety of the night, there is a restoration of identity. Kate and April are no longer just names in a headline. They are part of the story of a community that refuses to let their light be extinguished by the darkness. They have their peace. And you, as the rain continues to fall outside your window or the quiet of the night settles around you, you have the safety of your home. Let the questions rest. You are safe. Good night. As the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles cast rhythmic patterns of blue and red against the asphalt of Beaudesert Binley Road, the focus of the first responders was entirely on the preservation of a single life. The man lying on the pavement, later identified as Blake Sears, was in a critical state. His breath shallow and his body broken by the impact of the vehicle. Paramedics worked with a practiced, quiet intensity. their hands moving through the kits and cables required to stabilize a body in shock. There was a particular gravity to the scene. Beyond the blunt force trauma typical of a high-speed collision, there was the unsettling presence of that deep laceration to his neck, an injury that seemed out of place, a detail that didn't quite fit the physics of the crash. While the medical teams focused on the immediate clinical needs of the patient, the police officers on the scene began the methodical process of gathering information. In the pockets of the man's clothing, or perhaps within the scattered personal effects recovered from the immediate vicinity of the impact, they found the primary key to the morning's unfolding mystery: his identification. It was a routine step, the kind performed 1,000 times a day by officers across the country. Yet this specific piece of plastic carried the weight of an impending tragedy. The name Blake Sears was logged, but it was the address listed on his documentation that would soon change the trajectory of the entire investigation. The address pointed toward a residence on Beliva Road, a location tucked away in a suburban pocket known for its stillness. As the dispatchers ran the details through their systems, a geographical realization began to set in. The crash site in Logan was roughly 10 miles away from the quiet suburban home where Sears lived with Kate and little April. In the early morning hours, 10 miles is a significant distance, a drive that takes one past sleeping storefronts and through the long shadows of the eucalyptus trees that line the Queensland roads. This 10-mile gap represented more than just physical distance. It was a missing window of time. As the ambulance pulled away, its sirens wailing toward the hospital with Sears inside, the police were left with a haunting question. What had happened in that house on Beliva Road before the car was put into gear? And what had led a man to leave his home and end up, injured and desperate, on a busy stretch of road 10 miles away? The officers who climbed into their cruisers to conduct the standard death notification or welfare check at the family home had no way of knowing that they were traveling toward a scene that would haunt the community for years to come. They were simply following the trail of a man found on the road, unaware that the quiet 10-mile drive would lead them into the heart of a silence that could never be undone.